Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate your time. My name is Gareth Tate. Today I'm going to be talking about our project called An Eye in the Sky. And this is effectively a project that we have implemented to address Africa's wildlife poisoning crisis. For those of you that don't know, we are currently experiencing an African vulture crisis, with many populations of vultures across the continent rapidly declining over the last 20 years. In southern Africa alone, 5 of our resident vulture species have recently been uplisted to critically endangered, or even vulnerable globally. Across vulture range states, poisoning is by far the biggest threat, and the multi-species action plan developed for vultures across their 128 range states has identified that poisoning has been the main driver behind mortalities over the last 20 years. The African Wildlife Poisoning Database has been a vital tool in terms of capturing and consolidating and monitoring wildlife poisoning events and mortalities across the African continent. It's also allowed us to identify trends and countries where poisoning is most prevalent, but also to look at what species it's impacting the most. Since the early 1990s, close on 45,000 total mortalities have been recorded and captured on the Wildlife Poisoning Database, and these have been linked to about 1,500 total poisoning incidents. Of these, we've recorded over 15,000 total vulture mortalities. Unfortunately, lower taxa are poorly represented within this database, but it is clear to see that vultures are represented in 88%, a vast majority of all mortalities recorded. The largest mortalities for a single species have been recorded in African white-backed vultures. The database has also allowed us to visually analyze and assess where these poisoning events are occurring, and some of these date back as far as 1961. The database has been extremely useful, allowing us to identify poisoning hotspots across the African continent, and within Southern Africa, for example, it has allowed us to identify sites where we need to implement our poisoning intervention and response training. Vultures are particularly vulnerable to poisoning, and this is largely due to their ability to travel in large groups and cover vast distances on their daily mission to find food. And when they encounter a poisoning source in the landscape, hundreds of birds can be killed on a single poisoned carcass. Vultures are poisoned for a variety of reasons, and some of these are more ominous than others. In southern Africa, we've seen a spike in poisoning where vultures are targeted for their body parts for their use and trade in traditional medicine. We've also seen vultures fall as the unintended victims to poisons left out for predators or crop-destroying species, or when poisons are actually left out for other species that are also harvested for their body parts, such as lions and leopards. Apologies for the graphic images, but these photos bear testament to the dreadful nature of poisoning. Illegal trade has seen thousands of vultures poisoned as a result across Africa, devastating populations and driving them rapidly towards extinction in the wild. Scavenging mammals, including lions, hyenas, and leopards, are also severely impacted by poisoning. Of great concern is the growing demand for lion body parts, and lions are frequently poisoned and slaughtered for their bones, paws, and teeth for their use in both local and Asian traditional medicine. A key factor limiting our capacity to reduce or avoid the large-scale loss of wildlife to poisoning is our ability to locate and respond quickly to poisoning events. The early detection of a poisoning source and the decontamination of a poisoning scene radically reduces the further loss of wildlife, and fast action also allows response teams to save surviving wildlife, which will regularly occur at poisoning events, and of course for law enforcement officials to follow up swiftly on poisoning events. To address this ominous threat in southern and East Africa, the Endangered Wildlife Trust has turned to vultures to save themselves, and we have harnessed the natural sentinel and foraging behavior of vultures to our advantage and coupled this with novel GPS tracking technology, developing a pioneering rapid poisoning detection system which we call Eye in the Sky. Using extensive vulture GPS tracking datasets, we have been able to develop unique algorithms which enable us to classify vulture behavior according to their movements, allowing us to monitor their daily activity and identify key sites of interest. The system closely monitors the behavioral signatures as well as immobility and spatial clustering in GPS-tracked vultures in almost near real time, and allows us to remotely detect the presence of poison sources or feeding events associated with potentially poison-laced carcasses. Using GPS-tracked vultures, we have developed an effective monitoring system that applies these algorithms and also implements machine learning as well as built-in device activity sensors that is able to rapidly alert us to vulture mortality, even within an hour of death. This has important implications for triggering mortalities due to poisoning, especially in poisoning hotspot areas, allowing for the early detection of wildlife poisoning events. One of the most important aspects of our Eye in the Sky project is that the early detection of a poisoned carcass or a bait source and the immediate decontamination of a poison scene drastically reduces the further unnecessary loss of wildlife. As mentioned before, an important output or product of our Eye in the Sky system is that we often encounter a large number of vultures that are still alive on poisoning scenes. And by rapidly rescuing and administering basic poisoning first aid, we're able to save countless vulture lives. In 2022 alone, we have saved over 75 vultures in the greater Kruger landscape that would have certainly died if we had not detected and responded to these poisoning scenes. Over the last 5 years, the Endangered Wildlife Trust and its partners from Contemplate Wild have been developing various monitoring and technology solutions to make our alert system even more practical in the front line. One of the biggest accomplishments has been the full automation of our system that is able to regularly query data from our tracked vulture subjects, process or analyze the tracking data received, and then push near real-time alerts to various front ends so that our partners on the ground can respond to these as they receive them. Our system now talks to front ends such as Earth Ranger, which is a useful monitoring software platform used by the vast majority of our partners in protected areas. Importantly, we're also able to push alerts through to WhatsApp, emails and SMSs for when individuals or partners are not behind their computers. So where are we now? In concert with the development of our Eye in the Sky system and pushing our alerts to various front ends, we've been setting up an ever-growing network of GPS-tracked vultures across poisoning hotspots in southern and East Africa. And these are actively surveying extensive wilderness areas that would otherwise be impossible to monitor. We currently have over 180 birds of 5 different vulture species deployed for the system and covering approximately 2 million square kilometers, which are monitored in near real-time and Earth Ranger software predominantly. These birds are pushing alerts through to various front-end platforms that are actively being used by response teams across Africa, and this is enabling them to react rapidly to poisoning events. Although we have to really acknowledge the sensitivities of using vultures for this particular application, it is important to report some of the results. And since May 2020, we have used tracked vultures to discover or detect 5 wildlife poisoning events. And this has allowed us to effectively decontaminate these scenes and, as I mentioned before, prevent the further loss of wildlife to these dreadful scenes. We've also located a variety of carcasses that have either been poached or have died from natural causes, and this is really useful for the management of wildlife within protected areas. An important aspect to discuss is of course, the funding needed to sustain this initiative, and we have a vision to scale up the project to include all the poisoning hotspots across the African continent, and this, of course, is not a cheap exercise. Currently, it is certainly a costly process to keep our system operational within our current 6 focal countries. First of all, the Eye in the Sky costs approximately $120,000 per annum, and this includes, of course, the system updates. We are continuously fine-tuning the system to improve our alerts and the way we push alerts through to front ends, and this also takes a lot of maintenance of our servers and our API. Then, of course, we need to continuously redeploy and replenish tracked vulture subjects across new landscapes to include into the Eye in the Sky system. Another important factor is the majority of our birds are tracked with GPS tracking units that rely on Iridium satellites to transmit and receive data. And of course, we have to pay the data subscriptions to enable this continuous live feed of our tracking data into our Eye in the Sky system. We therefore need to pay quite exorbitant Iridium data download costs, which we obviously need to find sustainable funding for. And that brings us to a close for my presentation. I'm sorry that I've had to rush through it a bit, but in 10 minutes it's a little bit of time to talk about a really big project that we are truly proud and excited about. If you have any questions, please do contact me, preferably on my email, but also feel free to WhatsApp me on my cell phone number. Thank you very much.